welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Ethan.
And welcome. So, Ethan, do you want to explain a little bit about how you came into this show?
Yes, I largely got into it because of you and our friendship. You can talk about this, but you love old TV shows, and way back in like high school, you wore this MASH t-shirt all the time. And it's not something that like we addressed at that moment, but you know, a few years later, I was just finding things to watch kind of out of boredom. And I threw on the first episode of MASH, and I texted you about it, being like, oh yeah, you know MASH, right? Like, I thought the first episode was kind of interesting. And then you were like, oh, do I know MASH? And oh boy.
Yeah, boy, do I know MASH.
Why don't you talk about how you got into the show a bit? Because yours is more interesting than me.
So anyone who knows me knows that I'm a really big old sitcom connoisseur. I love old sitcoms, and I have since I was very young. In fact, I started watching MASH when I was probably 11. Yeah, 11. And I was obsessed with it from the period of like 6th grade until now.
And were you watching it with like family members? Like, was it a thing like you and your mom did, or was it just like you alone?
It was on after another show that I watched after school. And then it turned into one of those things where I was just watching it constantly because it was just on. And I was like, oh, this is funny. These are adults on TV. Like, I like this. So that was kind of my first. And from MASH, I started watching a lot of other old like 1970s, 1980s sitcoms. So it was MASH started me off on TV, basically.
And we should also address, like, part of the reason why we're doing this show is that you and I just like to talk about TV with each other. Like,
yeah, definitely.
I'll just text you about really any show that I'm watching that I know that you have also watched. So we thought to ourselves one day, why not turn that into what everybody does and do a podcast about it? So
let's monetize our hobbies.
Exactly.
So as we said, we're going to be talking about the first episode of the show in a minute, but some general facts about the show overall. It first aired on CBS from 1972 to 1983 with 11 seasons and 256 total episodes. So we are in it for the long haul here.
This is going to be a several-year-long project, my friends. Doesn't matter if nobody listens, we'll be here.
We're committed. So it was developed for television by producer and director Gene Reynolds and writer Larry Gelbart. It's based on the novel by Richard Hooker of the same name and the 1970s film by Robert Altman, also of the same name. The show, definitely the series, is probably the most widely known and widely loved version of MASH. We have actually both. Well, I've read the book. Ethan's seen the movie recently, and by far, I think that we agree that MASH, the series, is definitely the best iteration of MASH. Do you agree?
Yes. We will eventually cover the book and the movie, I think. I think that would be an interesting exercise. But by far, this is the one that's most enjoyable. Like, not to rag on the movie or anything, like, that is an Oscar-nominated film. But Alan Alda is Hawkeye. Like,
definitely. Absolutely.
It's what everybody knows. It's what everybody's seen. MASH was the highest rated television thing ever for a long time with the series finale. MASH is huge, and to this day it's huge. Like, since we started talking about this, in my like custom newsfeed that Google gives you, it's like, oh, here's an article about MASH written like a week ago. And I'm like, why are people still writing about MASH?
So what's also interesting about this, speaking of like the movie and the show, Gary Burdoff, who plays Radar, he was the only member of the original cast of the movie to return and play a regular character on the show. He played Radar in both the film and the show, and he was on for quite a number of years. He's a great actor. He is the only Radar. He's the only Radar.
See, what's funny about Radar is that, like, he's supposed to be 19 or something, and
Gary Berghoff is so old.
Very clearly is not 19. No shame to him, but there are some scenes later on where he like takes off his hat and you're like, oh, this is not a young man.
Yeah, definitely. So this is the last thing. This is the most interesting to me by far. The show aired during prime time while the Vietnam War was still ongoing. And even though it's largely commentary about the Korean War, its overall commentary is about America's larger role during the post-World War II/Cold War era. And I thought that it's very obvious in the show that is what they're commenting on with any kind of like anti-war sentiment that's ever presented during the show.
We'll get into this with the actual episode discussion, but it makes it very clear that the characters do not want to be there and are not interested in war. And I imagine during this time period, this was a little more like controversial of having these kind of anti-military characters be the leads of such a popular TV show at the time. Maybe that's why it resonated so well and lasted for longer than the Korean War itself, which we'll get into more as time goes on.
Yeah, definitely.
Everything relating to how they handle the war and the army and everything. Because it does come out swinging. Even in this first episode, they do mention quite a bit about their disdain for the general war machine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, I wouldn't call it throughout MASH, I definitely wouldn't call it a pro-military show, for sure. It's very real in the sense of war is not good for anyone involved. So with that said, let's get into the episode.
Yeah, boy.
In this episode, Hawkeye and Trapper throw this illegal party and fundraiser on the army base in an attempt to raise money so they can send their houseboy Ho-Jon to college back in the US. So, Ethan, what did you think about the opening credits of the show?
This is a very solid opening, and I'm very interested in this as a pilot. I think it's a very good pilot. It establishes the characters very well and has a lot of energy that is very unique to the show. Even before the opening credits, before they play the theme song, it quickly establishes everybody, kind of how their characters work, and their relationships to each other. You see Hawkeye and Trapper playing golf in landmines, and then you also see Burns and Houlihan kind of acting like they're having a regular meeting, but then the camera like pans down to their feet and you can see that they're like playing footsie with each other, kind of showing their dual nature.
Yeah.
And it's all very like lighthearted, and then radar senses the helicopters coming, and it's just an immediate switch to, oh, we have to get into game mode here.
Yeah, definitely. I know that we both found this interesting, but in the opening sequence, it says Korea 1950, 100 years ago. And that's so interesting because even though we're not 100 years out from the Korean War, we're watching this well after the Korean War had ended. And I really do feel like this show was meant to memorialize this time. Like, hopefully we're never going to get here. Hopefully this feels like is 100 years ago by the time, you know, we're all looking back on this and we're saying, oh God, how could that have ever happened? That's so long ago, even though it's not that long ago. So what were your thoughts on that too?
The title card is very interesting to me. It's one of those things that you can easily forget as you watch the show, but it's having older media be period pieces, like in itself, is already like one of my favorite kind of subgenres of things. Like I love the movie like American Graffiti, where that is a 1970s film that takes place in the 1960s. And this feels very similar, where they're taking something that did not happen that long ago, and with this title card, treating it like, oh, this is a bygone era. And like you said, maybe having it, I really do want to know their intentions. I'm sure it's been written about, and I'm sure we can look this up as we go on. But I do want to know their intentions with this title card, whether it was supposed to be like you said, an indictment of look how far we need to go.
Yeah, like I get what you mean of more look how far we need to go, or is it like look how far we've come, or is it look how far we've come kind of thing. Like from a spectator's view.
It's a very interesting title. It's a very interesting way to set up the show.
Yeah, I agree.
Because the Korean War wasn't that long ago when this aired.
I think that it really captures the show so well of this everyday mundane, kind of just wasting time, not really doing anything with these doctors. And then as soon as those helicopters come down, they are at it. It's a very chaotic energy in the beginning of the show, like in the title sequence. It's kind of an elongated title sequence with the theme song and whatnot. Usually it's quite quick, I would say. I feel like this did a really good job of establishing the energy of the show, of like this funny nature, but also there's serious aspects to the show. And absolutely.
We should also talk about the theme song. Which
yeah, the theme song
in the film has lyrics, and I was very thankful knowing what the lyrics are now that the TV theme decided to do it instrumental, because the lyrics are bad. And just
so what's so funny about sorry to cut you off, but what's so funny about the lyrics is that so Robert Altman directed the film, and he said that he wanted lyrics to this movie that were so like beyond ridiculous. He used the words like that don't make any sense. He wanted something that doesn't make any sense at all. And so he tried to write them himself, but then he gave the assignment to his 14-year-old son, and his 14-year-old son actually wrote these lyrics, "Suicide is painless," and it wasn't supposed to make any sense. So this like really hard "Suicide is painless" was actually like meaningless, completely meaningless, and written by some 14-year-old edgy kid, probably.
That's incredible. I didn't know that. That's awesome. Yeah, that makes sense, because I won't hurt your ears with me singing the lyrics to this, but they're not good, and the instrumental is so much more like foreboding and melancholy. It's a very interesting way to open a TV show. Be like, hey, we're gonna vaguely talk about suicide in our opening credits. Just know that. And this is still a fun 1970s sitcom.
I think it's so funny about the sitcom as well that it's almost like the complete opposite of MASH. Like on the lyrics to the original song "Suicide is Painless" on its face are so dark and so like really depressing and terrible, and really they mean nothing. And with MASH, the show especially, on its face, it's so funny and so comical and so meaningless. And then underneath, it really is super dark and super, depressing and real. So I think that obviously, I don't know if that was intentional, but it's very funny.
Yes, I think it works very well to set the tone. That's what this episode is really good at. It's good at setting the very complicated tone that MASH apparently has. It really doesn't feel like a lot of other older sitcoms. It has things that are serious, things that are very lighthearted, and that's, I think, what makes it so interesting to revisit as someone who did not grow up with it at all. I really appreciate how they're able to balance the tones of everything and have it feel more complicated than you would give something like this credit for.
Yeah, definitely. I absolutely agree with you. All right, so moving on into the actual substance of the episode. So the episode starts after the theme song with Hawkeye in a voiceover writing a letter to his dad saying, "Oh, sorry that you didn't like how upset I seemed in my last letter." What did you think of that? I really thought that it was a really good way to set up the show and what they were doing there. What did you think?
The letter is very good. I know that is a recurring thing. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I haven't seen this whole show. I've seen maybe the first 3 seasons, and then I kind of dropped off. I know that Dear Dad letters are a recurring thing, and I think opening it with that and having Hawkeye kind of talk about how they're not trying to be the best surgeons in the hospital. They're trying to be just keep people alive and keep people going. You know, it's not funny at all. Like, there's no real jokes in it. Again, just a good tonal balancing thing of like, oh, these hospital scenes are gonna be serious. We're gonna talk about how like dangerous working in this MASH unit is. And then kind of as soon as they get out of it, they're making jokes and like, oh, I didn't want to, like, they establish immediately like, oh, we're drafted here. We're not trying to be top of our game. We don't want to be here, and we're going to make fun of Burns along the way.
Yeah, that's really funny that they, to me, it's really funny that they establish so soon on that Margaret and Frank are so insufferable. They're so insufferable. It's so bad. And throughout the episode, it becomes so clear that they are the quote unquote bad guys. They are definitely the regular army types. They are very serious about the army and rules and regulations and stuff. But also, of course, they're hypocrites because they are, you know, they have like a kind of relationship. It's more established in throughout the show. But in this first episode, you kind of definitely get something there that they're, you know, there's something going on there.
In like one of the first scenes is like Hawkeye trying to like convince Lieutenant Dish to do something, and he's like kissing her neck and like just, you know, doing stuff, and then it goes to them and they're like, oh, that's disgusting, that's awful, and they start like making out. It's like, oh, they are just the worst hypocrites imaginable.
I think that it's really funny that poor Larry Linville, who plays Frank Burns, he did it so well. He was so insufferable. It was so funny. All the actors did great, but I can't imagine another actor being able to play this like terrible, just loathsome character as well as Larry Linville did, and all the crap that, you know, the pranks and stuff that they pulled on this character was just so funny throughout the show. And he seemed like such a you have to be a good sport about it when your character is that bad.
In this first episode, like they come out swinging. They drug him. They put a knapsack over his head. Like, they don't hold back, and this is the first thing we see of them. And we should mention that like Hawkeye and Trapper are kind of, you know, nefarious a little bit. Like, this is one of in my head, every older sitcom is like I Love Lucy, where it's just kind of sexless and like everything is like moralistic and everyone's nice. But like this, they do establish immediately like that like sex exists. And I think for the time, it might not have been like groundbreaking, but I imagine that this was still like pretty novel to have characters even just say like, oh, what do people want? They want to have sex. I imagine that was like, whoa, you can't do that on TV for the time.
They definitely provide pretty good comic relief for the entire show, and it's Hawkeye's character especially. He's like a dog, right? That's very well established in this episode. He's not married and Trapper is, so obviously there's like a moral kind of thing where it's like, oh, he's cheating on his wife. Well, that's awful. But also it's more or less overlooked in the show, especially in the first couple of seasons, where like being faithful was kind of out the window. And I think that that's really interesting. And I wonder if that was a lot of commentary, too, about kind of war. And I do wonder how realistic it was of like, well, we might die, so let's just do whatever we're doing here and, you know, not worry about it. I think that they were, quote unquote, like, I think that they were the bad boys, like you said, for sure, but in a pretty non-threatening, like non-bad way, as much as you can be a bad boy in a non-bad way.
Yeah, I mean, this first episode is about them like trying to raffle off a date with a nurse, and like in your
we should probably get into
like
that,
in your 2021 brain, it's like, oh, that may be something that doesn't hold up, but they play it very like playfully, like that whole montage of Hawkeye coming out of the couches to like try to kiss her and everything. Like, it's very, yeah, maybe this kind of like aggression isn't something that you would necessarily do today, but it's also played like very like cutesy and like, oh, it's just, they're just trying to have fun here. They're not trying to hurt anybody.
So that being said, it's very well established that they're pranksters and that they're kind of, mischievous and stuff like that. The bulk of this episode is about them trying to raffle off a date with a nurse to raise money for their houseboy Hojan to go to college. They need to pay his tuition and they need to get him to the United States. How did you feel about that? What did you think about that?
I really liked it. Because, like we've been talking about, they are, especially for the 70s, I imagine having these characters was kind of bracing, where it's like, oh, they're not, like, upstanding guys. They don't like the army. They're trying to cheat on their wives. But also, their goal for this episode is, like, one of the most, like, sweet things that a person could do. Try to get a kid into college in the United States. Like, that is an objectively noble, nice goal for our heroes to have. And like everything else they do is kind of like counterbalanced by that, where it's like, oh, they're maybe not pursuing this the best way, but they're also trying to do the nicest thing that they could possibly do for this young man. So it's a very fun way to establish them as our heroes while having them be more rapscallions, I guess you could say.
What a word.
Than what might be expected of a TV character at this time.
Yeah, definitely. I would say so. Oh, you know what I want to talk about? I want to talk about definitely Henry's character. So in the show, too, they were trying to get the weekend passes for this date with a nurse to get Hojan to college and whatnot. And they had to go through Henry with it because Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake is the commanding officer. He originally signed off on it. And then what did they do to Frank that they were like, no way? He was like, you can't do it.
Frank broke their distillery, which is very important landmark of the show. It's funny that they broke it in the first episode, and then they bag him and they throw him out of the tent. And, Henry doesn't want to be court-martialed. I'm surprised that I'm the one explaining the plot to you. You've seen this more than I have.
I literally just watched it, and I've watched this now like 5 times, and I completely forgot why Henry was like, no, you can't do this.
But I love Henry. Henry's a good guy. Henry is probably one of my favorite characters in the show. He's just very lovable. He's a big, nice teddy bear of a man, and he loves fishing. And spoilers for this 40-year-old program.
Is whoa. Okay. No, don't spoil anything. Henry's character is really interesting to me too, because he is so clearly not good at being the commanding officer, because I don't think he wants to be there any more than anyone else. I don't think that his character is really a career army guy like, say, Frank or Margaret is. And he revokes the weekend passes because he doesn't want there to be a party in his absence, because he's going to meet with a general in Seoul or something like that while the party's supposed to take place, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he is very much like, and this goes on throughout the show. Henry has one of my favorite quotes in the entire show. One of the best jokes. It's very throwaway, but it's so funny. We'll get to it later on. So speaking of this party, even though Henry says, no, you can't throw this party, when he goes away, Hawkeye and Trapper drug Frank Burns, they sedate him, and they throw the party anyway. So of course they end up raising the money for Hojan. It's great. They end up raising $1,800, which, thanks to inflation calculator, we know that is now equivalent to $20,000. So they raised $20,000 for Hojan. Yeah, that's
a lot
crazy.
Of money. I had no idea.
So that's really cool. And then, of course, Margaret has to come in and ruin it. And she actually calls General Hammond, who Henry was meeting in this episode. And he comes and tells Hawkeye and Trapper, you're under arrest because you're going to be court-martialed because you threw this illegal party, and you that's it. It's all bad. So you start to think, oh no, like, how are they going to get out of this? They had mentioned that soldiers were going to be coming in any minute on choppers, and they were going to have to do surgery. And basically they said to the general, do you really want to court-martial us right now? Because all those men are going to die if you don't have all hands on deck right now. So they pull the general in, and basically that saves them from being court-martialed for throwing this illegal party. What did you think about that?
Like I've been just mentioning over and over again, I like how they are established in this episode. Like, even to go back a little bit, the winner of the nurse raffle, they rig it so it's the priest of the MASH unit. And it's one of those things where it's like they didn't need to do that, but it further establishes them as good guys in the scenario. Giving a nurse to a priest is a funny thing to do. We can cut that, like, my last sentence.
No, I mean, like, it is pretty funny. Like, no joke, it is funny.
It's a funny thing to do. And yeah, having this thing happen where they're gonna get fired or not fired, they're gonna be put in jail, but then they're saved by the fact that they're good at their job, kind of justifies or further justifies all their very not good actions in the episode. Like, they did drug a man, and it's played for laughs, and it's like, oh, it's just Frank Burns, like, who cares? But, like, maybe you shouldn't drug your fellow co-workers on this army base.
Yeah, what really struck me about this part was that this is something that we see throughout the show a lot, actually, that the antics and the jokes and the pranks and the anger sometimes at other characters has to get left behind when they enter OR. There is no other option. Like, they are there to save lives, and it's anything else is kind of put on the back burner when men come in and need to be operated on. And I think that was really well established in this episode, kind of like a callback to that title sequence where they're kind of just all like, lollygagging around, just wasting time, stuff like that. And then as soon as choppers come in, they're on it, and they are doctors and nurses and people after that. So yeah, I thought that was really, really well established. And of course, at the end, funny, because Hawkeye and Trapper come out in handcuffs saying, wait, we're ready to go. We're going to be court-martialed. We're good with this. And then they say, damn, we got out of it.
Screwing up in the wrong way.
Yeah, exactly. It was really funny. Yeah, I just thought it was great.
Yeah. Before we fully wrap up, I just want to acknowledge one joke that I really love from this episode is when Henry tells them, like, oh, you can't hold this party. I wasn't totally cool with it anyway because I'm going to be off base. And just the look that Trapper and Hawkeye give each other,
yeah,
I think is incredible. Like, oh, like a fully, like, hard to explain on audio. So maybe I shouldn't have brought it up, but just the look that they give them is so...
It was very knowing, yeah.
So cute, for lack of a better word. I was like, oh, this is going to be a fun show. Is there anything you want to mention before we wrap up?
So I really do think that we would be remiss to not mention the fact that, and this is ongoing as well throughout the show, but some parts of the show did not age well. So in the first episode, there is a character who he's a black character. His name is Spearchucker Jones, and that is in itself quite racist. And in the 1970s, the character was cut because his nickname was so racist. Like, it just didn't bode well.
He's a character in the movie too.
Yeah, exactly.
They use him when they want to play football. It's not great.
So, which I felt was really unfortunate, because I think that having a black character in the 1950s army could have added some perspective. The show didn't really touch on so many social issues about race, but it didn't shy away from it either. And I really do feel like an opportunity was missed there to add something to the show. But also there's a joke in this episode where Trapper says, oh, maybe we could sell Spearchucker in his sleep. And it doesn't hold up well. It's not great. Again, the show doesn't need to be condemned, but it's certainly a racist, off-kilter, not funny joke that just absolutely didn't hold up well. So, but other than that, like, I think the episode's fun and great, and there are some race problems in the show, but of course, it's from the 1970s about the 1950s, so we'll definitely run into some more of those.
As we talk about this show more, it will be interesting to kind of see what holds up and what doesn't. Because, like, comedy is supposed to be, like, provocative, and it's, like, set against the culture it's made with. So it's just, I'm sure we'll have this discussion a few times.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you have any final thoughts on the show? Are you excited to watch the second episode?
Yes, I am. I'm excited to watch 256 more, or whatever it was. This pilot is really good. It's very ahead of its time. It has energy that I'm not expecting from a show like this is so old. And it's also very well shot. We should mention that, but it won
I agree.
2 Emmys for writing and directing, and it very much deserves it.
Yeah, it was nominated, but didn't win.
Okay. Especially on Hulu, like, it's presented in widescreen, and the widescreen, like, looks nice, and, like, you can tell that it's not shot on, like, a soundstage, just like most sitcoms of this era are, where it's like, we have many cameras, and we're gonna film it like a play, and we're gonna cut from angles. Like, it's kind of cinematic, like, the angles that they do in this. And
absolutely.
I was very impressed by that.
Yeah, there's a lot of aerial views of this episode. I can't really recall if they keep that kind of thing in there, but definitely for this episode, it was very cinematic. I definitely agree with that. Overall, I think this pilot was great. It was a very good first introduction to a very already beloved cast of characters and setting and stuff like that. I think it established what it wanted to do really well, and obviously it took off because there were 11 seasons. So
it lasted longer than the Korean War.
Yeah, exactly.
Cannot be overstated. That is insane.
So that's it for this episode of MASHmouth. We just wanted to thank Jacob Freer-Balco for being our technical consultant, Melissa, my sister, for cover art, and of course, our listeners. As of this recording, we do not have our music, but when we do, it will be linked in the description. You can follow us on social media at Valiantly Off Balance, and join us next week for our discussion on Season 1, Episode 2. And until then, put a hole in one into a landmine.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.